So Ben's Chili Bowl is a hot dog joint. And the essence of Ben's is a hot dog joint. We want to never, ever forget that. A good tasting, quality, good ingredients, hot dog. Nowadays, of course, we have turkey dogs, we have veggie burgers, and we have all that. Michelle Obama demanded that we get some healthy food in here. Anything you say, Madam First Lady? So we did. But to us, this is much more than obviously a hot dog joint. This is a historic gallery. This is a community center. They started feeding activists in 1963 in the March of Washington, and then feeding activists in 1968 Poor People's Campaign. Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign was right around the corner at 14th and T. It began feeding people in the Marion Barry campaign of the late 70s and 80s and 90s. Jesse Jackson, 84 and 88. This has always been a space of organizers coming, feeling comfortable to be among themselves and talk among themselves, eat a good, cheap chili dog, nourish yourself for the movement for the civil rights. The movement always needs to be nourished. Across the street, 1250. When you walk out the door today, you'll see 1250. That was the headquarters of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Eleanor Holmes Norton was there, Stokely Carmichael, Marion Barry, Johnny Wilson. Anybody ever heard of the Wilson Building? Johnny Wilson. All SNCC organizers. Frank Smith, Cortland Cox. I first came here in 67. I was in SNCC in 64, 65, 66. I had the honor in winter of 67 to be kicked out of SNCC by Stokely Carmichael. It's when SNCC moved from a multicultural organization to a black power organization. And he didn't kick us out in a negative way at all. It was a real serious dialogue about it's time for African Americans to take charge of their struggle only. And so I came down here, I saw the SNCC headquarters. First thing I did is came across the street and got a chili dog. Haven't left since 67, so we're talking 51 years now. Welcome to Ben's. You know, I was reflecting for a second. This is such a great renaissance in this city in the last 20 years. And so much of it really depends on the untold story of you guys. I mean, you guys don't get the credit of the kind of work you do every day, day in and day out, in the neighborhoods, in the communities, and you have significantly affected the positive life in this community. So thank you all for that. First thing I want to do is go over the materials with you. Please open your packets of material. There's a lot of stuff there. I'm going to run through it very, very quickly so that you'll know what you have in front of you. First of all, that big colored piece of paper here, may I borrow it?
Of course.
This is hot off the press. This is something I've been designing this for the last 10 years in a sketch form, carrying it around with me, but this is now professionalized. This is my critical race theory timeline of African American history in North America. Critical race theory is a form of pedagogy which interprets American history from the perspective of race, not from the perspective of the great dead white men. Nothing wrong with the great dead white men. However, 41 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners. 25 of the signers of the U.S. Constitution were slave owners. 12 of our first presidents were slave owners. So interpreting in critical race theory is to interpret American history not from Thomas Jefferson's perspective, but from the perspective of the young girls that he raped. And so this timeline, and if you look at the yellow bar at the bottom there, the yellow bar talks about, gives you an idea of 246 years of slavery, 1619, 1865. And from 1865 to 1968, 101 years of Jim Crow. Which if you add the two numbers up, you get what? 246 and 103 equals? 349. 349 of what? 349 of white supremacy, right? So let's think of it like that. Let's put ourselves in the perspective of only 51 years or thereabouts of legal equality. If we're talking about putting racism on the table, let's put it on the table. The very soul, the very DNA, the very character of our country is built on 350 years of white supremacy. How can we talk about putting race on the table if we're not going to talk about that? So critical race theory helps us understand that, helps us understand who we are as a country. And if I go to the next piece, a little poem by Langston Hughes. I too am America. Look at the second paragraph. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen. Go to the next thing in front of you. And what we have here is a picture of Carter G. Woodson on the front page. This is a packet. This is the basic outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not going to go through all of this, of course, but I want you to flip through the images because the images are going to inform you of where I'm going in the next 30 minutes. This talk today is called DC America's Black Mecca, the First in Freedom, First in Leadership. First in freedom, first in leadership. Anybody who's been first freed, like first generation in college, etc., knows that they have a responsibility to go back and bring forward. So this lecture today is about that, trying to put racism on the table in relation to history. I mentioned today in Black History, January 17. Can anybody tell me really why is Black History in the month of February? Why is Black History Month in February?
One of the reasons commemorate Carter.
Whoa. This is good. We all starting off real good. Wait a minute. Now, I also want you to be honest, too, okay? All right, let me ask the question again. And I want you to all jump, just talk. Why is Black History Month in the month of February? Go. Speak up.
Carter G. Woodson's birthday, and I think Frederick Douglass.
Okay, somebody else. Lincoln's birthday, excellent. What else? Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
It was Negro History Week first.
Excellent. Anybody else? Anybody else? Anybody else really want to tell the truth? Yes, ma'am. Go ahead, please. Thank you.
I didn't know that's what you were looking for.
No, I wasn't looking for anything. And Tamara told me you're all a bunch of smart people. Now, she told me that you guys know what you're talking about, that you're here because this is really interesting for you. But every time I ask this question of high school students, of college students, of anybody other than smart academics and organizers and activists like you, I get, what do I get? Gretchen, say it. The shortest month of the year, because the white man gave black people the shortest month of the year. Again, shortchanged. But who said Negro History Week? There you go. The reality is, of course, on the front cover there, you have Carter G. Woodson. The reality is that Mary Church Terrell, in 1895, was the principal of the M Street School, which later on becomes the Dunbar High School, which in 1870 was the first high school in America, here in Washington, D.C. And Mary Church Terrell in 1895, who, by the way, was one of the founders of the National Association of Colored Women, later to become National Council of Negro Women, Mary Church Terrell decided in February that she was going to make February the 18th Frederick Douglass Day in her school because her friend Frederick Douglass had just joined the Ancestors, 1895. And so every day when she had the power in her school to make a day devoted to studying Douglass's speeches, she would do that. And then one day in 1924-25, she said to Dr. Woodson, Dr. Woodson, I got a good idea. I think we should devote 1 week a year to the study of Negro history. And Dr. Woodson said, Dr. Terrell, that is a good idea. When do you propose we do this week? And she said, Lincoln's birthday and Douglass's birthday, second and third week of February. I tell that story because what I'm going to suggest to you in a few minutes is putting racism on the table also means studying the truth about our history. What is our true history here in Washington, D.C. and throughout the nation? The more that we understand our history, the more that we can appreciate who we really are and not be afraid to say who we are. It changes our perception of ourselves. Not just black people, white people. All people have a different perception if they understand that the white man did not give the black community the shortest month of the year. They, in fact, took it for themselves. 1967, Howard University students took over the administration building and demanded Negro History Week be changed to Black History Month. And they asked their friend John Conyers in the Congress if he would pass a resolution. Of course, he did immediately. Voila, Black History Month. I'm going to do 4 things today, real quick. Number 1, I'm going to give you a very brief history of D.C. black history, very brief D.C. black history overview. Number 2, I'm going to suggest to you, which I just did, that putting racism on the table also means studying black history and culture. Many of you are already attuned to it. I can see it, I can hear it from you. But what about the 7-year-old? What about the 12-year-old? What about high school students? What about my students at George Washington University that can't answer most of the questions that you answered this afternoon? They don't know these answers. They don't know their history because we do not teach African American history and culture, underline the word culture. We do not teach African American history and culture in our school system. But the more we do, the better perception that we have of who black people are. As a matter of fact, the great wealth of this amazing country, the great, deep, deep wealth of this country, I would argue as a historian, is built on 5 simple words. Sugar, tobacco, rice, cotton, and slaves. The whole wealth of this country is built. And from there comes banks, and comes the railroad, and from there comes insurance companies, and great buildings and great cities. But slavery built the wealth of this country. Number 2, I'm going to suggest to you that studying black history and culture puts racism on the table. Number 3, I'm going to challenge the word gentrification. I don't use the G word. I just used it. That's the only time I'm going to use it. I'm going to challenge the word gentrification because I think it's inaccurate. I think it sets people up for failure. And I think it creates tension between white people and black people that's unnecessary in our community. So I'm going to challenge that. And in fact, I'm going to leave you with a question as we walk to next door. I'm going to lead you with a question as to whether or not the G word is accurate. And we can discuss it over a glass of Bordeaux. As a matter of fact, I'm going to ask you a question, and that is, who really started gentrification in Washington, D.C. anyway? Who really started gentrification in Washington, D.C. anyway? And number 4, the last thing I'm going to impart with you today is I want you to help us here at Ben's Chili Bowl. See around you? I want you to help us preserve, protect, defend, advance, celebrate, and revitalize this extraordinary history, which I refer to in the title of my talk, America's Black Mecca. Not DC's Black Mecca, but America's Black Mecca. How do we preserve this? DC has gone from 75% black from Chocolate City, now down to 45% black and decreasing. With the lessening of the black population also comes black institutions. They move, they leave, they die. Churches, some of our great, great African American monuments have closed in the last 10 years, right here in this city. So I'm going to ask you and help us, because that's what you're doing now. You're here helping us already to preserve this incredible history. Have you all seen the mural in the alley? Good, 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 good. That's preserving this history. That's sticking this history in your face. That's what murals are all about. So those are my 4 topics for you this morning. I'm going to be looking at my notes because if I don't, I'll just ramble. What I will not be talking about today is implicit bias, structural racism, white privilege, multi-ethnic movements, all of the good stuff. And I'm very impressed with your list of 6 lectures tomorrow. Very impressed with what you guys are working on. It's an old African proverb. An old African proverb that says, know thy history, know thyself. Know thy history, know thyself. And if you don't know thy history, you're lost. And all the talks that I give in the high schools and all the talks I give at GW and at Georgetown and at AU and Howard, they don't know this history. And if they don't know this history, they don't really know themselves. And if they, DC people in particular, or people in Maryland, Virginia, and DC, don't know this amazing regional history, they really don't know themselves. So let me ask you a couple really quick word association, word association questions. You ready? Who's the first African American to play Major League Baseball? With these questions, I want you to pull out your critical race theory timeline. Pull out your critical race theory timeline. Come on, you all got the February Black History Month, right? See, now, Mr. Daryl Darnell is now getting into, he's getting into my skin here. And somebody just said something about you don't trust your answer?
No, I said it's not Jackie Robinson.
Fleet Walker.
Who said that? Now you got your Google map out? Are you Googling anything?
No, I'm not.
Now you guys are getting warm. You guys are getting really warm. June Kress, I'm really going to have to, where's June? I'm going to really have to be on my game here. You got a bunch of smart people you hang around with. Other than you, 100% of people say Jackie Robinson. But Daryl is actually right. It's how you ask the question. If I said who was the first African American to play Major League Baseball in the 20th century, you would say, thank you. But look at 1896. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate but equal. Who said Moses Fleetwood Walker? Michael, you get a gold star. No, you don't get a gold star. You get a black star because I teach black history. Michael, Moses Fleetwood Walker, 1884. Played with the Toledo Blue Stockings. Hit .248. Was a center fielder. His brother played on the team. But then something happens in 1896. Now black people can no longer play in white sports, sit on the front of the bus, use the library, etc., etc. Who freed the slaves in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation? I didn't hear you.
Abraham Lincoln.
Speak up so people can hear you.
Abraham Lincoln.
Thank you.
It was the 13th Amendment.
Oh! All of a sudden you realize that these are all trick questions, aren't they? But here's the point, right? Here's the point. I can't trick you guys, because apparently you guys have been studying before you got here. You've been reading up on everything before you come to my class. By the way, this is not just a back room. This is actually a lecture hall. This is called the Ben Ali Lecture Hall. Everybody says that Abraham Lincoln's freed the slaves. Who's Georgetown named after?
King George.
Now, such trick questions. Now you're really going to be thinking deeply. King George 1, 2, and 3, King George 2, but King George 1 and 3, between the three of them, they stole 4 million Africans. Who's Alexandria named after? Alexandria, Egypt. Alexander Hamilton. Huh?
Speak up, Phil.
I just threw that out.
Come on,
Alexander the Great.
Who?
Don't be embarrassed. Come on, Phil.
I think his name is
Alexander the Great. Good. Work with me. Follow my logic, okay? Where I'm going with this. Captains John and Philip Alexander were the largest slave owners in Northern Virginia. Hence, our city of Alexandria. You're in the neighborhood of Shaw. What's Shaw named after? You're in the neighborhood of Shaw. Actually, technically, on this side of the street of U Street, you're in Cardozo. On that side of the U Street, you're in Shaw. What's the historically black community of Shaw where I live? I live around the corner 3 blocks away. Who's Shaw named after? Who? General Robert Gould Shaw. Who's Berry Farms named after? Who? Who's Berry Farms in Southeast named after? Who? Thank you. Oh, what'd you say? No. Who said no? I said, is it really? You should figure it out by now that you don't answer the question if you think it's obvious. Everybody says Marion Barry. Who doesn't love Marion Barry? Of course I'm going to name Marion Barry Farms after Marion Barry. Named after David and Julia Barry in 1868, who sold 325 acres of their farm, their slave farm, no longer enslaved, to the federal government to build a new village for newly emancipated black people. Because they had to get rid of all those contraband camps in Washington, D.C., of the thousands of African Americans who ran away from slavery in North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, and came into D.C. to be free because of 1862, April 16th. So you got these thousands of people here with no place to go, living in tents, so they built Berry Farm in Southeast. If you go to Berry Farms today, and you go through and you'll see all the names of all the streets are named after abolitionists today. Which begs the question, who's Howard University named after? All right, I'll give you an easy one. Who's buried in Grant's tomb? Who's Howard University named after? And the reason that this is instructive, because this is not just a black history story, this is an American history story. Turn to your front page of Carter G. Woodson. I'm going to do this real fast, because I got 10 minutes and I have 30 minutes to talk about. I want you to walk through these images with me. I'm going to get to Howard in a second. First thing you'll see is the outline of my lecture. The second thing you'll see is a map. See the map of Washington, D.C. in 1792. Your nation's capital was built on slavery. Your nation's capital was built on tobacco plantations. Black people here were 3-to-1 to white people in 1792. It takes a lot of human labor to plant, to chop, to cultivate, to roll that tobacco known as green gold. The golden weed made a lot of people very rich. Turn to your next page. There's a chart of the free Negro population between 1800 and 1860. Interestingly, in 1800, 20% of the black people here were free. By 1830, 50% of the black people here were free. What does that mean? Going back to the title of my talk, First in Freedom, First in Leadership, by 1860, 80% of black people here were free. We now think that it was much, much more than 80%. We think it's about 90%, because when a census taker came around in 1860 and said, Mrs. Jones, how many people you got in your house? Mrs. Jones would say, well, I got my grandma, and I got my husband, and my 3 children, and our cousin. That's 7. Mrs. Jones didn't tell him about the 2 people in the outhouse running away from North Carolina. She didn't tell him about those 2. But what's happening here is between 1800 and 1860, this enormous growth of the free black population in a slave state. D.C. is a slave state. First in freedom, first in leadership. How did they get free? They got free because community and friends and family got them free. Turn to your next image. You'll see a picture of Washington, D.C. In 1791, it was a perfect diamond. In 1791, the founding fathers, in their brilliance, they made D.C. shaped as a perfect diamond because this was going to be the crown jewel of this new experiment called democracy. But in 1846, what happens? In 1846, we're no longer the diamond, we're now the fractured diamond. The fractured diamond because Alexandria and Arlington took back their land because they got 2 more pro-slavery votes to protect slavery in Virginia by taking back their land. We're now the fractured diamond. Even the very outline of our city is based on this thing called white supremacy. Turn to the next page. You'll see 2 pictures, two portraits. One on the top is about as big as this wall here. This portrait is Abraham Lincoln reading the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation on July 22nd, 1862, to his cabinet. That picture is in the United States Senate stairwell. You can go see it today. It's a brilliant painting. It's there. It took him a whole year, the painter, to paint it in the White House. Lincoln was smart enough to realize that this was an epic moment. I'm going to bring in an artist to sketch this moment. And he did it. But interesting in this painting, if you look on the bottom right-hand corner, there's an empty chair. And in that empty chair, you can't see it too well if it's in black and white, but there's a red shawl. Those of you who have it in color, you can see the red shawl on the chair. You can sort of make it out in black and white. Why would a great artist put an empty chair in a painting? Well, we finally figured out, historians figured out years and years, 100 years later, that sitting in that chair was Anna Ella Carroll. Her grandfather was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Her father was the governor of Maryland. Her uncle was a senator of Maryland. They owned 325 slaves on the eastern shore of Maryland. She owned 25 herself. She hated slavery. And she told her dad, as much as she loved her dad, I have to leave here. I can't do this anymore. I'm going to Washington and help Mr. Lincoln end slavery. She was sitting in that chair. She was a military strategist in his cabinet. She strategized the Vicksburg campaign, which was a major victory in 1864 in the Civil War. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if they're going to paint out a white, wealthy woman from history because she's a woman, they sure enough going to paint black history and omit black history from the textbooks. That's the point of the painting. Go to the next picture, please. So yes, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a revolutionary document. Revolutionary. It opened the door to run away. It opened the door. 4 million enslaved people 4 million people were enslaved in the South. But as a matter of fact, signing the piece of paper, making it go into effect on January 1st, 1863, freed no one. No one was freed with a piece of paper. It was only when people like little Jackson, the drummer boy, heard through the grapevine that if I run away and I go on the other side of the ridge and those men in blue over there, they will set me free. As a matter of fact, that's what he did. This is an actual photo taken in 1864. Little Jackson runs away in rags, enters the Union camp, and one night after he's cleaning the pots and pans, he's pounding on the pots and pans. Sergeant walks by and goes, son, where'd you learn how to play those pots and pans like that? Little Jackson said, well, my daddy taught me how to play the drums, and my granddaddy and great-granddaddy, and go back to Africa, right? Sergeant said, well, son, you're really good at that. We just lost our drummer boy in the last battle. The youngest drummer boy killed in battle was 9 years old. What was the drummer boy? The drummer boy is in communications, the most important person on the battlefield. Most important person on the battlefield. Forward, backwards, right, left, bring in the artillery, bring in the cavalry. Who's the first person they try to shoot? The drummer boy. That's why they were small. They were harder to hit. He could have laid down on the farm. He didn't know who was going to win. He was doing fine. But he chose not to. He chose leadership. once he got his freedom. Go to the next photo. And I want to try to close up here. And then I want to try to raise this question of the G word before we leave. So you have two monuments in Washington, D.C. to emancipation. You have one behind the U.S. Capitol in Lincoln Park, the one on the left. This is why it's important to study history to help us end racism. In fact, that's not what happened on the left. What happened on the left is Mr. Lincoln did not give the black man his freedom. Of course the Emancipation Proclamation was important, critically important, because when you run away from slavery and try to get free, which happens in D.C., people came into D.C., you weaken the Confederate Army, because every enslaved person was working for the Confederate Army as a supply team. So everybody that ran away weakened the army. But on the picture on the right is right down the street, 3 blocks away. This is the real reason that the slavery ended. 209,145 black men fought, 68,000 died in battle, 26 won the Congressional Medal of Honor. The war ends. Lincoln is forced to sign the D.C. Emancipation Proclamation on April 16th. The remaining 3,100 black people here were freed. 1,000 men joined the army. The war ends in 1865. The 13th Amendment, somebody said it earlier, was passed that actually ended slavery. And in 1867, and let me close up here, Howard University was founded. When Howard University is founded in 1867, by 1890, 1900, Howard University is producing most of America's black doctors, lawyers, dentists, architects, men and women of letters. And when you have a Ph.D. or a J.D. or an M.D. from Howard in 1900 or 1910 or 1920, you do not go back to Mississippi, because it is dangerous down there with a D after your name. You might become one of the most educated people in the counties of Louisiana, Mississippi, etc. So what do? You don't go back to Mississippi and South Carolina. You stay here in Washington, D.C., and you build what we refer to today as the Black Mecca of America. By 1920, there are 300 black businesses up and down U Street, 14th Street, and 7th Street. By 1955, Washington, D.C. becomes the first major American city majority black. By 1960, Washington, D.C. becomes the first major American city voting majority black. 1968, Dr. King is killed. By the late 50s, already African Americans who could leave here, left here, like everybody else leaves their old community, like Jewish people leave, like Italians leave, like my people, the Polish people. We left Baltimore. We didn't come back. People leave their neighborhoods. African Americans began to leave here in the 1950s and 60s. By 68, when Dr. King was killed, this place burned down. This place was not rioted. It was a rebellion. I don't like the word riot. I don't use the word riot. It was a specific, direct attack against a business that did not hire African Americans, 14th and U. After that, who wanted to come down here? And here's where I want to begin to close up and raise the question. After that, who wanted to come down here? I came down here a couple of weeks later from the University. I was in the University of Maryland in SNCC. University of Maryland as a student, excuse me. Came to the SNCC office across the street. Stokely was there. The place smelled. Nobody was here. It was charred. In the back alleys, you could still see some of the smoke still coming up a week or 2, 3 weeks later. By the 1970s and 80s, crack cocaine comes in, violence comes in, crime comes in. If the rebellion didn't run you out, then the crack cocaine ran you out. In 1986, they opened up the whole street for 5 years. They put in a 60-foot subway line. 5 years construction. Nobody came down here. Of the 300 black businesses that were once here, only 5 remain today. Ben's Chili Bowl, Industrial Bank of Washington, Lee's Florist Shop, the Black Masons Masonic Temple down a couple blocks, and Howard Theater. Only 5 remain. Marion Barry opens up the Reef Center in 1986 at the corner of 14th and U, where exactly the first brick went through the window at the People's Drug Store. Why People's Drug Store? Because they did not hire African Americans. So that was the first store that they hit. When they busted the windows open, they looted the store, and after they looted the store, they burned it. You loot before you burn. Hello. And then when the fire trucks came, they tried to put the fire out, and the people threw bricks at the fire department. And the firefighter goes, "What are you throwing bricks at? We're trying to put the fire out." And they said, "Yeah, we want you to leave because we set the fire. Get out of here." And they left. And what did the fire do? The people didn't riot. The fire rioted. The fire jumped. And then you got a fire here and a fire there and a fire there, and you only have 10 trucks, and you got 20 fires. You can't put it out. And the fire just takes off. So when people say, "Oh, the black community burned their neighborhood down," no, they didn't. The fire burned their neighborhood down. Marion Barry sticks Reef Center right here on the corner. Subway opens up in 1991. Clinton gets elected in 92. Democrats come to town. There's a change in culture when the Democrats come to town. Republicans all live out in the burbs, way out in the burbs. Democrats come down. Real estate explodes. .com explodes. And we're now entering, and I'll close with this. Look at your red, look at your critical race theory timeline. Bring it out again, please. Look at your red bar. I argue there are 4 great waves of American cities. And you guys are all the experts in this, much more than me. Doug, you guys with your leadership stuff, with your Greater Washington stuff, you guys are studying this better than me. But my argument is that there are 4 great waves of American cities. Number 1, 1840 to 1945, industrialization. Farm boys and girls leave the farm to go to the factories. And the factories are in the cities. Black and white. Everybody. Come into the city, work in the steel mill, work in the auto factory, work in the electric factory, work in the meat packing plant. Industrialization. 1946 to 1990, suburbanization. Second great wave. Everybody wants a little patch of land to run the dog, a white picket fence, go out to the suburbs, but no blacks allowed. No blacks allowed out in the suburbs, so therefore, African Americans in the Great Migration, they come into the city. Third great wave. Some call it gentrification, I call it re-urbanization. You can call it Renaissance. You can call it swagger jacking. You can call it whatever you want to call it. I think the G word is an inaccurate word. Gentrification really comes from an English theory in the 19th century where the gentry had to take a 6-month apprenticeship after they graduated from Oxford and Cambridge in order to learn how poor people live. They had to take an apprenticeship in the slums of London. And after they did their 6 months in the slums, then you can become the governor of Jamaica, Trinidad, India, Japan, Nigeria, wherever there is an English-speaking colony. That's where the term gentrification comes from. It's my suggestion that the term creates divisions, makes white people look like enemies coming into our city here, and makes African Americans look like they're helpless. I live on French Street, 3 blocks away. A couple old black families are sitting on their stoop, watching me pull in and roll their eyes. There goes the community. They actually knew me because they knew me from Jesse Jackson and Marion Barry and all that, so it was cool. But today, we are a 50% white, 50% black block. Not one person in my block nor in my neighborhood has been evicted because of gentrification. Not one. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can talk to Alex Padro. You can talk all kinds of people. Talk to the council members. People in my neighborhood bought their home, their big Victorian in 1915 for $12,000, and they're selling it today for $1.4 million. Now, I know that there's pressures with taxes, and I understand all that. But there are more jobs in Shaw today. There's more better health in Shaw today. There's virtually no crime in Shaw today. The schools are better in Shaw today than ever. Is that gentrification? All the young white people and young black people also, young black lawyers and doctors moving into my street, are they the enemy? Or is this a renaissance? Or is this urbanization or reurbanization? Now, there might be some swagger jacking going on, and I'll close with this. There's the Ellington on this corner right here. Named after whom? The Duke. Right around the corner, there's Marvin's. Right around the corner. Who's Marvin's named after? Who was he? Where was he born and raised?
Here.
Thank you. What's that place called? Busboys and Poets, down the street from Marvin's. Who's it named after? Langston Hughes. You got a poem of Langston Hughes here today, don't you? Is it in your packet? What's that place called? Right around the corner on 14th Street. The Louis. Why is it on 14th Street, 14th and T? Because across the street was the Club Bally. It's Louis Armstrong's club. Hey, these are two-bedroom apartments for only $4,300 a month. 3 bedrooms for $6,000 a month. Up on the top floor, double D, on the top floor, they're going for $12,000 a month. You okay? You got a place to stay? You okay?
I'm in northeastern Brooklyn.
You're in northeastern Brooklyn, okay. That's down the street 3 blocks away. It's called the Brixton. What's the Brixton named after? What's the Brixton named after? Slums of London. Brixton, the African Caribbean community in London. And here's the only built new building on U Street that was burned down in a rebellion. United Bank, right down the street here, right on the corner. It's the only one that's got inside the photos of Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, et cetera, et cetera. Swagger jacking, folks. Swagger jacking is cultural appropriation. It's jacking up the swagger of black culture to make money off of it. Ain't nothing wrong with that. I would not want the Ellington to be called the Thomas Jefferson. So I'm fine with the Ellington. But if you're going to put up the Ellington, if you're going to put up the Louis, I want to walk into the front door and I want to see this. I want to see this. If you're going to make money off of Louis Armstrong, we need to know who Louis Armstrong was. So ladies and gentlemen, I think the study of African American history and culture would be significantly informative for young Americans, for white, for black, for Hispanic, for Asian, regardless. Because this is an amazing history. It's a positive history. It's something that we can all look at and say, my goodness, the African American people did this extraordinary thing here in America and built this amazing city called Washington, D.C., and Harlem, and Atlanta, and the Delta of Mississippi. So therefore, I close with this. Who started gentrification anyway? Let's talk about this next door. And number 2, are we experiencing gentrification, renaissance, reurbanization, or swagger jacking? And that begs the question, Doug, what's going to come next? What's the 4th great wave of American city? I'm going to suggest it's regionalization. I'm going to suggest we're no longer just a city. I'm going to suggest that Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. and the contiguous counties, we are one big city. When I pick up my son from GW, my son's now a sophomore at Xavier down in New Orleans. When I picked him up from high school at Lab School in Washington in Georgetown, when I leave GW, go pick him up and drive him all the way over to the Northeast to Catholic University at his mom's house, takes me an hour and a half in rush hour. But I can take a subway from Loudoun County right down to here in 20 minutes. Regionalization is our next great city. And it's going to be diverse, and it's going to be beautiful, and people are rushing to it. 85% of American people are going to be living in the cities by the year 2030. 85%, maybe 90%. Thank you for your time. I'll see you next door.